Hey everybody, it's Mrs. Wallace. I hope everybody is doing A-OK. I hope that you guys have a good break as well. I think everybody needs a little bit of time to unplug a little. But I just wanted to give you a short introduction to a topic that we'll spend just a class period or two on when you return from break. It is about the new monarch. So this is connected to the Renaissance. During the same time period as the Renaissance in Italy, there is moving, so we're talking the 1400s and the 1500s, we see a consolidation of power for monarchs in Western Europe, and oftentimes these are referred to as the new monarchs. And it's not that there hadn't been kings before, but we know with feudalism, kings just generally in the Middle Ages didn't really have extensive power. Rather, two other groups did. Generally, the nobles had a great deal of power in the feudal system. So you have, houses in a variety of different countries. For example, in England over here, during the time period of the War of the Roses, the House of York. So these various noble families have a great deal of power. And also the Roman Catholic Church had a great deal of power. And so in order for monarchs to move in on the scene and develop a strong base of power, they had to put down some of those other groups. And this map is of Europe around the 1360 time period. So this is actually an older map around the time of the plague. And one of the things that might catch your eye if you're looking at this map is all the variety of political entities, and that's exactly what Europe is like in the 1360 time period. So if we were to look like over here at Italy, we can see a great deal of division in political systems because of the variety of city-states. We can look over here in the Kingdom of Castile, Granada, which still might be kind of the Islamic Empire at this time. We also see over here in Eastern Europe a great deal of variety and political systems, but perhaps the place where it is most noticeable is in today what would be like modern day Germany, as well as part of France and part of Poland, this like Holy Roman Empire here. Okay, so this area right here is incredibly diverse with a great deal of political systems. And some of these areas that are really fragmented in 1360 will stay generally fragmented, but quite a few areas like Spain and France and England, we see kind of undergo, and Portugal too, to a certain extent, we see centralized kind of under the framework of one monarch, okay? So this is a picture, or a map rather, of the 1500s. Just gives you a little bit more of a sense of by 1500, the political boundaries of France are starting to look a lot more like France. The political boundaries of Spain starting to look a lot more like Spain. Okay, so we can kind of make that case. We also have the Byzantine Empire no longer on the scene. The Ottoman Empire is going to be replacing that. And we'll get to some of that. Right now we're still kind of looking at the Renaissance geography. The kind of thing that's perhaps most important about the new monarchs, right? These are going to be individuals who are going to rise to power. They are consolidating power. Think of this as an effort to centralize a political system, and they are essentially establishing the foundation for modern nation states. So the way that France, England, Spain might develop the kind of infrastructure for a government system that resembles what it does today's day and age, we start to see the beginning of that. And we're talking about 1460 to 1520. Okay, so kind of around, the time period of Christopher Columbus sailing to the Americas is when we have the period of the new monarchs. And that definitely ties together. The new monarchs will enable a great deal of new initiatives, including exploration. This is something that begins in the late Middle Ages, and it never will lead to absolute power. So later on in France, you might learn about absolutism and monarchs who have absolute power. That is not this. We're talking about new monarchs who have a significant role in leading a state, but nobles still exist, and there's still going to be checks on the new monarch's power. They are also leading what we would not describe really as nation states, in that these populations of people are generally much more connected to the regional hub. So you have a language group that's pretty unique, cultural groups. Without mass communication, you don't necessarily have this common culture that correlates with a political boundary. So they're not quite yet definitively. There's sections of France that are going to differ from each other, but it's starting to feel a little bit more like a modern nation state. An example is during the 100 Years' War, which is fought between France and England. Both countries will fight on and off for about 100 years. After that war is over, people in both societies much more clearly identify as either French or English, whereas their land ownership was kind of tied together for a while there. But still, in the Renaissance time period, we have kind of a local or regional culture. And our modern version of nationalism doesn't really emerge until later when we talk about nationalism in a modern context. But here's some of the key characteristics of the new monarchs, right? And we'll look at specific examples. Okay, Henry VII, Henry VIII, Louis XI. So the Henrys, of course, start the Tudor line in England. Louis XI in France really kicks off a new house of leadership within France. We also will look at Ferdinand and Isabella in Spain. They are the power couple that essentially will create funding for Christopher Columbus. So there's a few examples that we can look at. The key thing about all of these examples, whichever society in Western Europe, and it is a little different, by the way, in the Holy Roman Empire in Eastern Europe, and we'll address that. We see much greater fragmentation, not quite yet the strong monarchies, okay? And there becomes a little bit of a difference between the centralized and the decentralized powers in Europe. But there's certain characteristics that these monarchs have, okay? One of the characteristics, and this is like, how do you become powerful if you're a monarch and you're trying to push back the nobility, which has had the power for some time? You could try to tax the nobility. So we see leaders in France, for example, coming up with new taxes on bread or on salt. You might confiscate their lands, actually take over their lands, and most importantly, have a standing army. Armies that had fought previously in the Middle Ages are, groups of knights that operate under a particular lord, and oftentimes the role of the lord in dictating to the knights what they have to do, and the equipment was often bought by the knights. People who trained their whole lives to be knights took care of their own equipment. In the case of a standing army, it becomes a force that's more representative of the king and the king's initiatives, and those individuals are paid out of the royal treasury. It's like a totally different thing, and tax dollars will go to that. So more taxes, more military. There's also an effort to reduce the power of the church, and something that happens, for example, in France is the monarch will tell the church that the monarch is going to pick the bishops and the local church leaders, so that way the state is effectively over the church. There's also an effort to make things much more efficient in the way in which maybe court systems will work. The monarch will have much greater control over administration of the state. There will be a great deal of political influence from the merchant class. Bourgeoisie is going to be the merchant class. The monarchs and the merchants will, in a lot of cases, tie together and exclude the landed noble classes. And lastly, there'll be a great deal of loans. So, the Medici were bankers, and one of the places that they were loaning to included states. So we get this sense of what we would today call like a national debt, but a government debt. And some of those initiatives become not only lucrative, but have really big consequences, because they do things like create, Christopher Columbus's expedition to the New World, or sending ships to the area of India or into Spain goes to the Philippines. Portugal goes to India, into Macau, China, and essentially establishes a whole trading post empire in the Indian Ocean. So lots of these initiatives of creating wealth and debt from the Renaissance time period are going to play out in the way in which colonialism is going to happen. Okie doke. I'm going to leave it there. That's kind of an intro, and we'll talk about this a little bit more next class. Have a great break, guys.